The persistent drumming on the synthetic fabric above me was the first thing I registered, even before the chill seeped through my waterproof gear. Rain. Always the rain. It had a way of flattening the world, dampening sound, blurring the edges of everything, including clarity. I hunched my shoulders, pulling my worn jacket tighter, and stepped under the arching entrance of the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered. The air inside was thick, a peculiar blend of wet earth, stale canvas, and something metallic, like old pennies. A portable generator hummed just outside, its steady thrumming vibrating through the muddy ground beneath my boots and powering the harsh, fluorescent lights strung overhead. They cast a sickly yellow glow, stripping the color from the faces of the uniformed officers and the few investigators already present. Their expressions, even in the dim, artificial light, were a familiar mixture of grim resignation and quiet confusion. I understood the confusion. My own stomach had tightened into a knot the moment the call came in. Impossible. The detective had muttered, his voice strained even over the phone. That word, impossible, always got my attention. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down at the feet of everything I believed in. I nodded curtly to a uniformed officer who barely registered my presence, his gaze fixed on the center of the tent. My eyes followed his, scanning past the evidence markers and the tripods, past the careful placement of equipment. And then I saw it, or rather him. The victim sat at a small, rickety wooden table, the kind I might find in an abandoned hunting cabin. His hands were clasped neatly in front of him, almost as if in prayer or deep contemplation. His head was slightly tilted, eyes wide open, staring blankly at the far wall of the tent. There was no blood, no overturned chairs, no sign of a struggle, nothing. Just a man dead in a room that looked like he'd simply decided to take a very permanent rest. User Ed, glad I here. The detective, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weight of every case he'd ever worked, approached me. His gaze was weary, his brow furrowed. We sealed it off immediately. No forced entry, no disturbed perimeter, no prints we can find yet. The property manager swears the place has been locked up for months. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the material stretching taut over my fingers. Cause of death. The detective ran a hand over his chin, a rough rasp of stubble. That's the thing we don't know, no visible trauma, no obvious marks. He just stopped. I moved slowly, deliberately around the table, my eyes sweeping over every surface, every shadow. My training, years of it, kicked in. Observe, document, categorize. The victim was dressed in clean, if simple, clothes. No dirt, no mud, despite the sodden ground outside. His skin was pale, waxy, but showed no signs of lividity yet. He hadn't been dead long. I leaned closer, my breath fogging slightly in the cool air. His eyes, they were dilated, fixed, but there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible gray film over the pupils, like a thin layer of fine dust. It wasn't natural. I pulled out my penlight, switching it on. The beam cut through the dimness, highlighting the subtle detail. Then I saw it, and my breath hitched. Stretching from the victim's right earlobe, a single strand, glistening faintly in my penlight's beam, extended outwards. It wasn't hair. It was a spiderweb, a perfectly formed, unbroken filament anchored to his skin and then stretching impossibly to a nail hammered into the far corner of the wooden wall, several feet away. The web itself was delicate, almost invisible, yet it was there, intact. I froze. My mind raced, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew. A spiderweb undisturbed from his earlobe to a distant wall. It meant no movement. No sudden jolt, no struggle, no flailing arms. If he had slumped, if he had thrashed, if anyone had touched him roughly, that web would have broken. It was too fragile, too perfect. It defied logic. It defied physics. That doesn't add up, I murmured, more to myself than to the detective. What doesn't? He asked, stepping closer, his voice low. I pointed with my gloved finger, careful not to disturb the fragile strand. The web from his ear to that nail, it's unbroken, utterly intact. The detective peered at it, his eyes narrowing. He saw it too, his face already grim tightened further. So, if he was struggling, fighting off an attacker, if he was poisoned and convulsed, if he even fell forward, that web would be gone, torn. It indicates a complete lack of movement from the moment it was spun until now. I paused, letting the implication hang in the air, which means he was either dead or utterly still when that web was formed. And given the time it takes for a spider to spin something like that, it suggests he was in this exact, rigid position for hours, maybe longer, before death. Or he died and remained perfectly still. But how could someone die and remain perfectly still, upright, with no apparent cause? No human could have entered this room, killed him, and left him in this state without disturbing that web. Not unless they moved with the precision of a ghost. A memory, fleeting and unwelcome, of a whisper in the dark, a shadow that stretched too long. It was the kind of feeling that clawed at the edges of reason, a sensation I'd learned to suppress, to bury under layers of scientific rigor. But some things, like the rain outside, just kept coming back. Are I suggesting? The detective didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. The unspoken word hung heavy between us, supernatural. I pushed the feeling down hard. I'm suggesting we have a puzzle the likes of which I haven't seen in a long time. Everything about this scene screams impossible, but impossible doesn't exist, only unexplained. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus, to compartmentalize the unsettling nature of the scene. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, felt a tiny crack appear. Could I be missing something obvious? Am I letting the strangeness obscure a simple truth? The doubt was a bitter taste. No, I wouldn't let it. There was always an explanation. Always. Let's start from scratch, I said, my voice firm, pushing away the nascent flicker of uncertainty. I need a full sweep of this room, every square inch. We'll map every dust particle if we have to. And I want a full tox screen, blood, tissue, everything. This man didn't just decide to stop breathing, web or no web. Something made him. My gaze lingered on the victim's wide, unseeing eyes. The rain continued its relentless assault on the tent. This wasn't just a murder, it was a statement. And I had a feeling this statement was only just beginning to unfold. The relentless drumming of rain on the temporary canopy of the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, was a constant, irritating companion. It mingled with the low murmur of the generator outside, a mechanical pulse against the organic silence of the dead. My gaze, still fixed on the victim's wide, unseeing eyes, felt heavy. A statement, I'd thought, but what kind of statement involved? This, user Ed, I good to go? The lead detective's voice, rough as sandpaper, pulled me back from the precipice of my own thoughts. He stood by the tent flap, a silhouette against the gray downpour, his heavy-duty rain gear glistening. As good as I'm going to get, I replied, my voice a little hoarse. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the material snapping tight against my skin. The air inside the tent was cold, damp, and held the faint, metallic tang of fresh blood, overlaid with the earthy smell of wet soil. Any initial thoughts off the record? He asked, stepping further inside, though not too close to the scene itself. His eyes, usually sharp, held a flicker of something I rarely saw in him, uncertainty. I knelt beside the victim, a young man, perhaps early 20s, dressed in simple, well-worn clothes. No wallet, no phone, nothing immediately obvious to identify him. Off the record, I repeated, my eyes scanning the exposed skin of his neck and arms. Looks like he saw something truly awful, and whatever it was, it killed him. The detective grunted. We can all see that. I meant, how? I ran a gloved finger along the collar of the victim's jacket. No tears, no struggle. His clothes were damp but not soaked through, suggesting he hadn't been exposed to the rain for long before the tent went up. His hair was still slightly matted from the precipitation, but not plastered. The ground beneath him was soft mud, churned by the rescue teams and then carefully protected. But there were no deep impressions from a struggle, no scuff marks beyond what his collapsing weight would have made. No visible entry wound, not on the torso, not on the head. I began, verbalizing my initial observations for the detective, but mostly for myself. No signs of blunt force trauma that would explain the immediate collapse. His hands are open, not clenched defensively. No defensive wounds on his forearms. This was the first wait that doesn't add up moment. Someone doesn't just die like this, not violently, not without some sign of the struggle, the fight or flight response. So what? A heart attack induced by fear? The detective offered, a hint of desperation in his tone. I shook my head, my eyes now focused on the victim's chest. Not with that expression, and not with what I'm about to check. I reached for my kit, extracting a small, high-intensity flashlight and a magnifying glass. My training kicked in, pushing back the unsettling questions that gnawed at the edges of my focus. Methodical, scientific, that was the only way through this. I started a meticulous sweep of the body, inch by painstaking inch, looking for anything missed in the initial chaos. I examined his fingers, looking for dirt under the nails, for any fibers. Nothing. Clean. Too clean. Then I shifted to his torso, slowly pushing aside his damp shirt. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a wound in the conventional sense. Not a bullet hole, not a stab wound, not a ragged tear. Instead, centered on his sternum was a perfectly circular depression, no larger than a silver dollar. The skin was unbroken, but it was sunken, as if something had pressed in with immense, focused force. And around the edges of this depression, the skin was different. I leaned closer, bringing the magnifying glass to bear. The capillaries beneath the surface were ruptured, a spiderweb of crimson against the pallor. The skin in that circular area wasn't just depressed, it was almost crystalline. Tiny, almost microscopic fractures radiated outwards from the center, catching the beam of my flashlight like miniature shards of ice. It looked like something had punched a hole through him, but without breaking the surface. "What in the hell?" the detective muttered, having moved closer, his own flashlight beam joining mine. I touched the area gently with a gloved finger. It felt brittle like hardened sugar. "This!" My scientific brain was screaming. It wasn't a burn. It wasn't blunt force trauma in the way I understood it. It was a localized, extreme internal pressure combined with something that had flash-frozen the tissue. I brought out a specialized thermal scanner, sweeping it over the area. The readout confirmed my suspicion. The core of the depression registered several degrees below freezing, while the surrounding tissue was at expected post-mortem ambient temperature. "How is that even possible?" the detective asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "A localized frostbite wound on the inside." My mind raced, cycling through every scenario, every chemical reaction, every physical phenomenon I knew. Explosive decompression, some kind of cryogenic weapon, but there was no device, no residue, no entry point. I don't know, I admitted, the words tasting like ash. This was the reveal/discovery. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was a violation of physics as I understood it. Was I missing something obvious? Had I been staring at too many grim scenes lately, allowing my imagination to run wild? I took a deep, shaky breath, pushing the personal demons back into their cages. "We need to get the body out of here carefully, and I mean carefully. This wound, it's unlike anything I've ever documented. Every single fragment of this needs to be preserved, and I need a full toxicology, tissue analysis, everything." The rain continued its mournful drumming. The rain outside the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, hammered a relentless rhythm, a mournful drumming that seemed to amplify the silence inside. The detective, a man whose face usually wore a mask of weary competence, just stared. From the victim to me, then back to the man sprawled on the sodden earth. His gaze was hollow, mirroring the impossible scene before us. My kit was already open, the sterile gleam of instruments a stark contrast to the grim reality. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the snap of the material loud in the sudden hush that followed my words. The detective offered no immediate reply, still lost in his own quiet battle with disbelief. My gaze swept over the victim again, trying to compartmentalize the impossible. The man lay on his back, eyes wide and unseeing, staring up at the tent's plastic ceiling. His clothes, though damp and smudged with mud from his fall, weren't torn. No obvious signs of struggle on the ground around him. Just a man dead with no discernible cause of death and no weapon. The impossible. I pushed the thought down. Focus. User ed, focus on what I can see. I knelt beside him, the dampness seeping through my trousers despite the ground tarp. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and something else. A faint metallic tang, almost like ozone after a lightning strike, but without the accompanying storm. Or maybe that was just my mind playing tricks, trying to rationalize the irrational. I started with the hands, a forensic investigator's natural first stop. They were splayed out, palms up, fingers slightly curled. Not the soft, unblemished hands of someone who worked in an office or spent their days behind a desk. These were broad, strong hands, the skin roughened, knuckles slightly swollen, with a scattering of old scars, small, white lines cutting across the calluses. The nails were short, practical, though clean. The kind of hands that had seen real work, maybe even manual labor. A lifetime of grasping, pulling, lifting. "Any ID on him yet?" I asked the detective, not looking up. My mind was already cataloging, observing, trying to build a profile from the physical. A sigh, heavy and drawn out, came from behind me. "Yeah, we got him. He's been around. Names? Well, let's just say he was known for being a bit of a shark. A professional schemer, ran a few cons in his time. Never held down an honest job, far as anyone knew. Always seemed to have a clean suit, even when he was supposedly living out of a back room somewhere. Never lifted a finger if he could talk someone else into doing it for him." I paused, my fingers hovering over the victim's right hand. The detective's words echoed in my head, creating an immediate dissonance. Never lifted a finger. But these hands, these were working hands, hands that had known sweat and strain. The contrast was jarring. It was a subtle thing, easily dismissed by someone less attuned to the minutiae. For me, it was a discordant note in an already off-key symphony. "You're sure about that?" I asked, my voice flat. "Never worked." "That's the word on the street," the detective confirmed. "Been picked up for fraud, embezzlement, even a few minor assault charges, though those never stuck. Always managed to slip through the cracks." A real smooth talker, apparently, got people to do his bidding or just convinced them to part with their cash. I ran my thumb over a particularly prominent callus on the victim's palm, tracing the rough ridge. This wasn't a callus from holding a pen. This was from gripping something solid repeatedly. A hammer, a wrench, a heavy tool. It didn't fit the profile of a charming con artist who never broke a sweat. Anything in his pockets, a wallet, keys, phone? I pressed, shifting my focus to the victim's pockets, pulling out an evidence bag. Nothing, not a thing. Pockets were empty. No wallet, no phone, no loose change, not even a lint. The detective sounded exasperated, like he was stripped clean before he got here, but there's no sign of that, no drag marks, no struggle. This was another piece that gnawed at me. A man known for scams, for always having a trick up his sleeve, found with absolutely nothing. No identification, no means of communication. It felt deliberate. Too clean for a man who lived a messy life. I continued my examination, moving slowly, methodically. The victim's eyes were fixed, pupils dilated. No defensive wounds, as I'd noted earlier. No signs of blunt force trauma, no stab wounds, no bullet holes. The skin was intact, save for a small, almost imperceptible scratch near his left earlobe, thin as a thread. It looked old, faded, barely there, not fresh. My gaze drifted back to his hands. Those hands told a different story than the detective's intel. A story of physical exertion, of grinding effort. Was it possible he had a secret life? A past he'd carefully hidden from the world, from the authorities who thought they knew him? Or was this just a red herring, my mind trying to find a logical explanation for something that defied all logic? I felt a flicker of doubt, a momentary waver in my conviction. There was I grasping at straws, trying to find a mundane explanation for something clearly not mundane, simply because the alternative was too unsettling. His background doesn't match his hands. I finally stated, my voice barely above the drumming rain. These are not the hands of a man who never worked a day in his life. The detective looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. So, what are you saying, user Ed? He was a carpenter by day, con artist by night. There was a hint of sarcasm, but also genuine curiosity. Here that no one knows, and those hands, they're just the first chapter. The rain outside intensified, a sudden deluge that threatened to overwhelm the tense, fragile canvas. I pushed away the self-doubt. The ghost might be the headline, but the details, the discrepancies, those were my domain. And those hands, those honest, hard-working hands on a man described as a lifelong parasite, were screaming a different truth. A truth that felt far more dangerous than any phantom. The rain outside intensified, a sudden deluge that threatened to overwhelm the tense, fragile canvas. And those hands, those honest, hard-working hands on a man described as a lie. I knelt closer to the body, ignoring the growing chill that seeped through the damp ground cloth of the crime scene tent in the rain body just discovered. The air hung heavy with the smell of wet earth, a faint metallic tang, and something else, something acrid that my nose couldn't quite place. My gaze, drawn back to the victim's hands, lingered. They were sturdy, calloused across the palms and knuckles, the nails trimmed short and surprisingly clean. Not the hands of someone living a life of leisure, certainly not the hands of a schemer or a con artist as the initial whispers from the patrol officer had suggested. These were hands that built things or broke ground or hauled heavy loads. Hands that earned their keep. I gently, almost reverently, touched the back of the left hand, feeling the surprising warmth still lingering despite the exposed conditions. No defensive wounds, no struggle marks, just nothing. A man simply gone, his eyes wide open, staring at the canvas ceiling as if witnessing a final, impossible act. It was the sheer absence of struggle, the lack of any discernible cause of death on initial inspection that tightened the knot in my stomach. It wasn't just unusual, it felt familiar. The drumming of the rain on the tent fabric grew louder, a relentless rhythm that seemed to synchronize with an old, unwelcome memory asserting itself. The noise morphed, becoming the clang of corrugated metal, the howl of wind through a broken window pane, something that still made my stomach clench. The victim had been found slumped against a defunct hydraulic press, eyes open just like this one. But the scene, it had been a nightmare, not a single trace of an assailant, no forced entry, no weapon. Just a man gone. I remembered the way the lead detective, a gruff woman named Miller, had looked at me. User Ed, I read the one who sees what others miss. What do I see here? Because I'm seeing a ghost story. I had seen nothing, nothing tangible. I'd spent 3 days sifting through every speck of dust, every fleck of paint, every corroded bolt in that cavernous space. My colleagues had started calling it the impossible death. The preliminary report from the medical examiner had been a blank page where the cause of death should have been, a series of inconclusive and no visible trauma. Every test I ran came back clean. No poison, no blunt force trauma, no ligature marks, no sudden cardiac event that left a trace. It was as if the man had simply ceased. I remembered the crushing weight of that case. The hours I spent hunched over microscopes, my eyes blurring, trying to conjure evidence from nothing. The frustration had been a bitter taste on my tongue. The self-doubt had been a constant hum in my ears, louder than any laboratory fan. Had I missed something? Was I losing my edge? Was there a blind spot in my own scientific method, a fundamental flaw in my understanding of the physical world? The family, a quiet woman and her 2 young children, had come to the precinct. They had looked at me, their eyes filled with a desperate hope that I, the forensic investigator, could provide answers. I had nothing, just shrugs, and were still investigating. It was the closest I'd ever come to admitting defeat, unsolved, a permanent stain on my record, a gnawing cavity in my professional pride. It was the case that taught me that sometimes the world defied explanation, and science, my bedrock, could only take you so far. The sudden, sharp crack of thunder directly overhead jolted me back. My head snapped up, my breath catching in my throat. I was back in the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, my hand still resting on the victims. A bead of condensation, shaken loose from the canvas, splattered onto the man's forehead, glistening for a moment before I wiped it away with the back of my glove. The same lack of a discernible physical cause. The same feeling that the rules had been bent, or perhaps simply broken. Anything, user Ed? The detective's voice, muffled by the rain and the tent, pulled me further into the present. He stood at the edge of the yellow tape, his silhouette a solid block against the muted light filtering through the canvas. I stood slowly, my knees protesting. Nothing obvious, detective, which paradoxically is something. My voice was steadier than I felt, but it also ignited a stubborn refusal. Not again. Not another impossible case that would mock my scientific training. So, a ghost then? The detective's tone was half joking, half resigned. I shook my head, my gaze sweeping over the scene again, searching for anything that could ground this into reality. The muddy ground, the scattered leaves, the victim's unnervingly peaceful expression. No, detective. A ghost is a story. What we have here is a murder that just hasn't shown us its face yet, and I intend to find it. The rain outside hammered harder, a ceaseless rhythm, as if challenging my resolve. But this time I wouldn't let the inexplicable win. I couldn't. Not after last time. The rain outside hammered harder, a ceaseless rhythm, as if challenging my resolve. I couldn't. Inside the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, the air hung thick and heavy, smelling of wet earth, ozone, and something metallic that wasn't just the victim. The generator hummed a low, insistent thrum just beyond the canvas, powering the temporary lights that cast stark, unforgiving shadows. My breath plumed faintly in the chill. The ground beneath my boots was soft, muddy, despite the tarp laid down. I knelt beside the victim, a middle-aged man whose face was frozen in a silent scream. His eyes were wide, staring at the canvas ceiling as if witnessing some final, terrifying vision. The scene was still raw, the first responders having done little more than establish the perimeter and call for specialist support. The local detective, a burly figure with a perpetually weary expression, stood by the entrance flap, his presence a heavy anchor in the swirling unease. His colleague, younger, nervous, kept glancing over his shoulder. My gloved fingers moved methodically, adjusting the light, preparing my camera. I focused on the lacerations, the unnatural angle of the neck, the contusions that marred the skin, all standard if brutal trauma. But it was the lack of something, the absence, that always pricked at me. No obvious weapon, no sign of forced entry into the isolated structure where the victim was found, no defensive wounds that suggested a struggle against a physical assailant. I dismissed it, a trick of the wind, the heavy rain distorting sound. My mind, ever the scientist, sought logical explanations, drafts, vibrations, faulty wiring. I leaned closer, inspecting a curious mark on the victim's temple, almost like a faint, circular indentation, but without any break in the skin. Just as I brought my magnifying glass into position, the portable LED lamp I was using flickered once, twice, then died. "Generator trouble?" I called out, my voice surprisingly steady. The detective grunted. "Shouldn't be, brand new unit." I tapped the lamp, nothing. I swapped it for another from my kit. It clicked on instantly, bathing the victim's face in a fresh, bright glow. Probably a loose connection, I told myself, feeling a slight flush of irritation. Always something with equipment. I returned to the faint mark on the temple. It seemed to pulse almost under the direct light. My eyes scanned the immediate area around the body, looking for anything that might have caused such an impression. A fallen object? a blunt instrument. But the mark was too smooth, too perfect in its circularity, yet too subtle to be a conventional impact. It settled over my shoulders, prickling the fine hairs on my arms. I glanced at the temperature gauge on my belt. It hadn't budged, yet I could feel it, a profound, unnatural drop. "Anyone else feel that?" I asked, my gaze sweeping the tent. The younger colleague rubbed his arms, looking pale. "Yeah, actually, pretty sharp." The detective just watched us, his skepticism a palpable shield. Probably just the rain seeping in. But the canvas was taut, the ground dry within the perimeter. It clung, refusing to dissipate. I tried to rationalize it, a sudden gust of wind, a pocket of air. But the tent was sealed and the air within was stagnant. Then a low, guttural moan seemed to ripple through the tent. It wasn't human. It was a sound of deep, ancient sorrow, a vibration that resonated in my chest cavity. The younger colleague gasped, stumbling backward into a support pole. The detective's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm at his hip. "What in blazes was that?" The detective demanded, his voice tight. I froze, my hand hovering over a small, silver locket clutched in the victim's hand. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. No, not again. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. This was a crime scene, physics, chemistry, biology, nothing else. I gently pried the locket from the victim's stiff fingers. It was an antique piece, tarnished with delicate scrollwork. As I lifted it, preparing to place it in an evidence bag, it began to vibrate. Not a gentle hum, but a violent, frantic shudder that made my gloved hand tremble. A faint, almost imperceptible plume of vapor, like dry ice, curled from its surface. I dropped it. It clattered to the muddy ground, rolling once before settling. The locket, now lying in the mud, glowed, a faint internal luminescence pulsing with a soft, blue-white light. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. A chemical reaction, a hidden battery, but the locket was solid metal, ancient. There was no mechanism, no visible source of power. The detective and his colleague stared, mouths agape. My eyes were fixed on the locket, then on the victim. The faint, circular mark on his temple now seemed to glow faintly as well, mirroring the locket's strange light. It was no longer just an indentation. It was a brand, a symbol. My gaze snapped back to the locket. The blue-white light pulsed brighter, then abruptly extinguished. The locket lay inert in the mud, dull and tarnished once more, as if nothing had happened, but it had. I saw it. They saw it. I took a deep, shuddering breath. This wasn't just an inexplicable event. It was a physical manifestation witnessed by 3 people. My scientific worldview, my bedrock of logic and reason was not just challenged. It was crumbling around me. I looked at the victim, at the mark on his temple. Since the last time I'd faced something that defied all explanation. I'd spent years burying that memory, rationalizing it away, convincing myself it was a trick of the light, a faulty perception, a stressed mind. But this here now in this rain-soaked tent was undeniable. My hands, usually steady and precise, trembled as I picked up my camera. This wasn't just a murder scene anymore. This was a direct confrontation with something utterly beyond my understanding. And the worst part? A small, horrifying part of me recognized it. I had to find an answer, a scientific one, before it consumed me entirely. Otherwise, I might just break. The blue-white light pulsed, a silent heartbeat against the gloom. It wasn't a trick of the falling rain, not a glint off the locket's polished surface. It was emanating, a soft, internal glow that defied every law of physics I'd ever studied. My gaze snapped back to the victim's temple, to the faint circular mark that now seemed to mirror the locket's impossible luminescence. It wasn't just an indentation, I realized, not anymore. It was a brand, a symbol, etched with a light that shouldn't exist. User Ed, the detective's voice cut through the drumming rain on the tent fabric, laced with an impatience I usually found grating but barely registered now. "Are you going to tell me what you're seeing? Are we going to stare at this poor man all night?" I didn't answer. My mind was already racing, sifting through protocols, discarding them, then digging deeper into the recesses of my memory for every obscure theory, every fringe experiment I'd ever encountered. This wasn't a standard case. This wasn't even an unusual case. This was something else. "Get me the portable spectral imager," I instructed, my voice flat, devoid of the usual urgency. "And the micro-EMF scanner, everything. I want a full spectrum analysis on the locket and the victim's temple, and tell the perimeter officers to expand the exclusion zone by another 50 feet. No electronics in or out, no exceptions beyond what we're using." A young colleague, usually unflappable, swallowed hard, his eyes darting between my face and the glowing locket. "User Ed, the EMF scanner? We've never—" Now, I cut him off, not unkindly, but with an edge that brooked no argument. "And tell the crime scene manager I want the tent sealed tighter than a drum. I don't care if we have to duct tape every seam. No external light, no contaminants, nothing. The rain intensified, a relentless assault on the tent, creating a claustrophobic din that amplified the tension already thrumming in the air. My breath plumed in the cold, damp space. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, the sterile latex a thin barrier against the inexplicable. My fingers hovered inches from the locket, resisting the urge to touch it to confirm its bizarre reality. The colleague returned moments later, lugging a reinforced case. Inside lay the spectral imager, a device typically reserved for analyzing microscopic residues or hidden blood traces, and the EMF scanner, a clunky, custom-built piece of equipment I designed years ago for a cold case involving unusual electrical disturbances. It was overkill, a long shot, but I had a gut feeling that standard methods wouldn't even scratch the surface here. I carefully positioned the spectral imager, its array of lenses and sensors humming to life. The display flickered, then resolved into a series of spectral readouts. I focused it on the locket first. The blue-white light pulsed on the screen, a clear, unmistakable energy signature. But it wasn't just light. The device registered an entire band of frequencies I'd never seen before, not in any known material, not in any known energy source. It was a chaotic symphony of impossible wavelengths, dancing just outside the visible spectrum. "What is that?" the detective asked, peering over my shoulder, his skepticism replaced by a flicker of genuine bewilderment. "I don't know," I admitted, a bitter taste in my mouth. My instruments, usually my most trusted allies, were screaming at me that something was fundamentally wrong. "It's not emitting heat, not in any measurable amount, and it's not radioactivity, but it's energy." I moved the imager to the victim's temple. The circular mark, barely visible to the naked eye, flared on the screen, a perfect echo of the locket's signature. The same impossible wavelengths, the same unsettling energy profile. It wasn't a superficial burn, it was an imprint, an infusion. "Run the micro-EMF scanner," I instructed the colleague, my voice tight. "Focus on the mark, then the locket, then a control point on the victim's chest, and make sure the readings are isolated from our own equipment's fields." The colleague, his brow furrowed, meticulously followed my instructions. Scanner word, its delicate sensors sweeping across the victim's skin. The display remained flat, then suddenly spiked. Not a gentle curve, but a sharp, violent peak far beyond anything I'd ever witnessed. The numbers flashed, incomprehensible in their magnitude. "Localized electromagnetic field," the colleague murmured, his voice strained. "But, user Ed, this isn't right, it's too strong, and it's localized to just the mark. The control point is clear." I knelt, my face inches from the victim, from the glowing mark. My own breath hitched. The EMF reading was off the charts, but contained, almost perfectly spherical around the brand. It was like a miniature, invisible storm raging on his skin. But what kind of storm? And how was it being generated? My mind flashed back to the dusty tomes I'd sometimes consulted, the ones about ancient rituals and forgotten sciences, usually dismissed as folklore. I'd always prided myself on my scientific rigor, my unwavering faith in empirical evidence. But what I was seeing now, is it radiating out, or is it contained within? The colleague adjusted the scanner, his movements hesitant. The locket, still glowing with that impossible blue-white light, was placed carefully on a sterile cloth. The scanner registered the same colossal EMF spike, but this time something else appeared on the display. If it was an external energy source, the field should dissipate. But this was contained, almost like the locket itself was a tiny, self-sustaining reactor, resonating with the mark on the victim. "It's not just emitting energy," I realized, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "It's amplifying it, and the mark is a receiver." My instruments weren't malfunctioning. They were working perfectly, showing me something utterly impossible. My scientific explanation, my determination to find a rational answer, was faltering. The victim hadn't just been killed, he'd been interfaced with. Could I be wrong? Could I be missing something fundamental, something so obvious it was invisible? Or worse, was I finally losing my grip? The victim hadn't just been killed, he'd been unmade. Not a single external mark on his pale skin, no defensive wounds, no struggle evident in the meticulous arrangement of his clothes. Yet my instruments, usually so precise, were screaming. My spectral analysis showed a massive, localized impact, the kind that should have left a crater, not just a pristine shirt. The internal damage, which I'd only seen glimpses of through my portable imaging unit, was catastrophic: organs ruptured, bones fractured, all without a single point of entry. It was like he'd been crushed by an invisible hand, or perhaps, more accurately, an invisible force. Outside the crime scene tent, the rain hammered down, a relentless rhythm against the canvas, mirroring the frantic drumming inside my own head. My scientific explanation, my determination to find a rational answer, was not just faltering, it was actively unraveling, thread by thread. This wasn't just anomalous, it was an affront to everything I understood about physics and forensics. I ran the scans again, my fingers flying over the console, the faint hum of the machine a counterpoint to the storm. Readings didn't change. The sheer energy displacement detected at the exact moment of death was astronomical, far beyond what any human assailant could inflict without leaving a mountain of physical evidence. There was nothing. Just the man slumped in the chair, a picture of serene death belying the internal devastation. I leaned back, my eyes sweeping over the small enclosed space, searching for anything I might have missed. A stray hair, a fiber, a speck of dust out of place. Nothing. The meticulousness of the scene was almost as unsettling as the impossible cause of death. It felt staged, but for what audience and by whom, or by what? The word, the one I refused to even whisper in my own thoughts, clawed at the edges of my mind. A shadow fell across the tent opening, and a moment later the lead investigator ducked inside, shaking rain from his broad shoulders. He was followed by a junior officer, who immediately started setting up a portable evidence kit near the perimeter. The lead investigator's gaze swept over the scene, then landed on me, a question in his tired eyes. He was a man of procedure, of tangible facts, and I knew instinctively that whatever I was about to tell him would challenge the very foundation of his investigative world. "Anything, User Ed?" he inquired, his voice a low rumble cutting through the rain's roar. He didn't bother with pleasantries, which I appreciated. We both knew the clock was ticking and the media would be circling like vultures soon enough. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "It's complex. The victim, the cause of death, is severe internal trauma, but there's no external injury, no weapon signature, no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle." The lead investigator's brow furrowed. He took a step closer to the body, his experienced eyes scanning. "No blunt force, no puncture. Nothing," I confirmed, my voice flat. "It's like he spontaneously imploded from the inside, but without any external force applying the pressure. My instruments are showing energy readings that just don't make sense." I didn't mention the words impossible or ghost. Not yet. I still needed to find a scientific explanation, no matter how outlandish. "Well, we might have something that makes a little more sense," he said, turning from the victim. "One of the patrol officers picked up a witness just a few blocks away. Said he saw a vehicle matching the victim's description pull up around the time we estimate the incident occurred, and more importantly, he saw someone else leave it." My attention sharpened, a human element. Finally, this was what I needed, a tangible thread to pull. Someone specific. "A former business partner," the lead investigator stated, pulling a damp, laminated photo from his jacket pocket. He handed it to me. The man in the picture had a sharp, angular face, a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Alistair Finch. Had a nasty falling out with our victim a few months back. Public too, threats were exchanged, lawsuits filed. Finch lost everything, supposedly blames the victim entirely." I stared at the photo, then back at the impossible scene. Alistair Finch. A motive, a connection, a human suspect. It was almost too neat. What kind of threats? Verbal mostly, but a few anonymous messages were sent to the victim's phone and email, promising utter ruin and a fate worse than death. We initially dismissed them as hot air, but now... The lead investigator trailed off, his gaze returning to the victim. Reveals /discovery. And Finch was seen leaving the area in a hurry just as the rain started getting heavy. The lead investigator continued, voice laced with renewed conviction. The witness described him as agitated, checking his watch repeatedly, said he practically sprinted to his own car parked down the street. I felt a jolt of something akin to relief, a human face to this horror. It fit the narrative of a crime. It was explainable. But then the cold, hard data from my instruments flashed in my mind. The sheer, impossible energy. Could Finch, a disgruntled business partner, have generated that? Could he have delivered a fatal blow that left no external trace? "We're bringing him in for questioning," the lead investigator said, a determined glint in his eye. "He's our primary. Looks like a pretty straightforward revenge-killing User Ed. He was seen, he had motive, he had opportunity." My gaze drifted back to the victim, the stillness of the body, the lack of anything physical connecting Finch to this scene. No fibers, no skin cells, no disturbed dust. Just the impossible readings humming in my equipment. A revenge killing? Yes, that made sense in a human context, but the how was still screaming at me. A deep, unsettling doubt began to bloom in my chest, pushing back against the easy answer. This was a plausible human suspect, a perfect red herring designed to divert attention. But it didn't explain the unexplainable. It didn't explain the ghost of an impact, the shadow of a force that had torn this man apart from the inside. My internal alarm bells, usually so reliable, were ringing with a discordant note. This felt too convenient, too simple for a scene that was anything but. The rain hammered against the canvas of the crime scene tent, a relentless, drumming rhythm that seemed to mock the stillness inside. Each drop felt like a tiny accusation, reminding me how little progress I'd made, how much I still didn't understand. I was still inside the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something acrid, almost metallic that wasn't blood. My gaze lingered on the victim. Finch. That was the name the detective had given me. A man whose death was an anomaly, a statistical impossibility wrapped in a shroud of the utterly bizarre. No fibers, no skin cells, no disturbed dust, nothing physical to link a killer to the scene. Just those impossible readings humming from my equipment, a silent scream of electromagnetic chaos where there should have been only inert matter. A revenge killing. My mind clung to that, to the human element, because the alternative was... Well, the alternative was why I was here, feeling the gnaw of old doubts. Anything, User Ed? The voice belonged to the lead detective, a man whose patience was as thin as the plastic sheeting beneath my boots. He stood just at the tent's entrance, his silhouette a dark, imposing shape against the gray downpour. I didn't turn. Nothing that makes sense, detective. Still no physical trace evidence, no struggle, no entry or exit points for an assailant. My voice was flat, devoid of the usual investigator's confidence. It grated on my own ears. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire investigation. So he just died. No, I corrected, a sharp edge returning to my tone. He was killed. The internal trauma is clear, but how is the question? I gestured vaguely at the empty space around the victim. And by what? I knelt again, ignoring the damp seeping through the waterproof fabric of my trousers. My EM field reader, a compact device I trusted more than some people, was still chirping softly, its display a jumble of numbers that defied logic. Spikes, troughs, residual energy signatures that shouldn't exist in a static environment. It was like standing in the middle of a lightning storm, but the sky was clear and the air was still. This was the kind of scenario that made me question everything, made me remember the whispers from my past. I pushed the memories down hard. Science, logic, that was my anchor. I picked up the reader, intending to recalibrate it to check its internal diagnostics. Maybe it was faulty. Maybe I was faulty. As my fingers closed around the casing, a sudden, sharp crackle erupted from the device. The numbers on the screen flickered wildly, then dissolved into a chaotic static. A high-pitched whine pierced the drumming rain, growing louder, more piercing. "What in the blazes?" The detective muttered, stepping fully into the tent, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. The EM reader vibrated violently in my hand, a frantic pulse against my palm. The whine intensified, hurting my ears, and then with a sickening pop, a wisp of smoke curled from the device's main vent. Dead, my most reliable piece of equipment fried, my breath hitched. I stared at the inert device, then back at the victim. This wasn't a malfunction, not like this. This was targeted. I could feel the hairs prickle on my arms, a primal response to something unseen. It just... "Died," I said, the words echoing the detective's earlier, frustrated query. The irony wasn't lost on me. The detective looked from the dead reader to me, his brow furrowed. "Are you saying it was an electrical surge here?" He gestured around the muddy, rain-soaked tent. "No power lines anywhere near this spot." "No," I confirmed, shaking my head slowly. "No surge, it was something else, something that overloaded its capacity but without any physical conduit." My mind raced, trying to find a scientific explanation for the impossible. A focused electromagnetic pulse. But from what and why now? I forced myself to breathe, to push past the sudden surge of unease. My hands, despite their slight tremor, moved methodically. I set the dead reader aside and reached for my smaller backup thermal imager. If there was any residual energy, any strange heat signature, this would pick it up. As I scanned the victim's body, the thermal imager showed nothing out of the ordinary. Just the cooling body temperature, consistent with the time of death estimated earlier. My gaze drifted over the victim's exposed neck, then down to his chest. But something caught my eye, a faint, almost invisible mark just beneath the collarbone. It wasn't a bruise nor a cut. It was a series of tiny, raised bumps, arranged in an intricate, almost geometric pattern. It looked like a brand, but without any burn marks or scarring. It was as if the skin itself had been subtly altered, pushed up from beneath. I leaned closer, my breath held. The pattern was circular, with smaller intersecting lines forming what looked like an abstract symbol, no bigger than my thumbnail. It was so faded, so subtle that in different lighting I might have missed it entirely. It didn't look like any gang tattoo or cult marking I'd ever encountered. It was too precise, too ancient-looking. This was it. The first physical anomaly that wasn't directly related to the cause of death. This wasn't a wound, it was a signature. "Wait," I murmured, my voice barely audible above the rain. I reached for my magnified lens, my fingers fumbling slightly with the sudden rush of adrenaline. As I brought the lens into focus, the intricate lines of the symbol sharpened. It's not a wound, it's a mark, and it's been there for a while, almost healed into the skin. My mind spun. This mark, combined with the impossible EM readings and the inexplicable destruction of my equipment, started to form a terrifyingly coherent picture. A picture that defied every scientific principle I held dear. Finch wasn't just a random victim. He was involved in something specific, something that left its indelible mark not just on his skin, but on reality itself around him. And if that was true, then the ghost that killed him wasn't a random act of malevolence. It was a targeted strike. And that meant the impossible was no longer just a theory. It was a method. And I, User Ed, the pragmatic investigator, was staring directly into the face of a mystery that demanded I question the very nature of existence. This was going to be a lot harder than I thought. The rain hammered against the taut fabric of the crime scene tent, a relentless drumming that threatened to drown out my own thoughts. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic tang of damp earth and something else, something acrid and strange that my nose still couldn't quite place. Finch lay on the ground, still and stark under the harsh LED work lights. My mind, a whirlwind of conflicting data points moments ago, began to coalesce around a single, chilling hypothesis. He was involved in something specific, and whatever it was, it had left its signature all over this scene. I knelt again, ignoring the squelch of mud beneath my boots. The detective, a burly figure whose face was a mask of professional skepticism, watched me from the edge of the tent, his arms crossed. He hadn't said much since I'd pointed out the impossible EM readings and the fried state of my spectral analyzer. He was waiting for me to make sense of the nonsensical, and for the first time in my career, I felt the familiar weight of expectation mingled with a genuine, unsettling fear. My gaze returned to the distinct, almost branded mark on Finch's chest. It wasn't a bullet wound nor a knife wound. There was no charring consistent with a direct electrical arc, no visible entry point for a conventional energy discharge. Yet the tissue around it was subtly discolored, almost compressed. It was as if something had been slammed into him with immense force, but without leaving a corresponding impact mark or blunt trauma. It was too clean, too precise. I ran a gloved finger lightly over the victim's shirt just above the mark. No tears, no singe marks. The fabric was intact. My eyes then swept over the ground directly beneath Finch's torso. Nothing, just the churned mud and a few stray leaves. No projectile, no device, no residue that my initial sweep had detected. My internal monologue was a rapid-fire cross-examination. Electromagnetic interference, strong enough to scramble sensitive equipment. A localized energy burst, powerful enough to leave a physical mark on human tissue, yet seemingly invisible in its delivery. And the reports from the initial responders, the sudden drop in temperature, the sensation of being watched, the fleeting, almost imperceptible visual distortions. They dismissed it as shock, as mass hysteria, but my equipment had confirmed the EM spike. This wasn't a ghost. It couldn't be a ghost. My training, my entire career, was built on the bedrock of empirical evidence. But the evidence here was screaming something equally unbelievable, something that pushed the very boundaries of what I understood science to be capable of. I remembered the shattered screen of my spectral analyzer, the faint hum it had emitted just before it died. It wasn't a random EMP, not like a lightning strike or a power surge. It had been focused, targeted. The readings had been off the charts, but also specific. A frequency, a resonant frequency. A cold dread seeped into my bones, colder than the damp air in the tent. Technologies that could manipulate energy at a fundamental level. Technologies that could, theoretically, create a localized, intensely focused electromagnetic field. What if the ghost wasn't a spirit but a manifestation of such a field? A field so precise, so powerful that it could interact with matter, disrupt electronics, and even cause physical harm without leaving conventional forensic traces. The mark on Finch's chest. If an electromagnetic field could be tuned to a specific resonant frequency of organic tissue, it could cause cells to vibrate, to heat up, to rupture, all from within. It could leave a brand not from external contact, but from internal cellular collapse. The lack of entry or exit wounds, The intact clothing, it all started to make a horrifying kind of sense. My breath hitched. This wasn't some random attack. This was calculated. This was a weapon. A weapon that mimicked the supernatural, a weapon that could be deployed without leaving conventional physical evidence of its presence. The destruction of my equipment wasn't incidental. It was a deliberate countermeasure designed to erase any digital footprint of its activity. "User Ed?" The detective's voice rumbled, pulling me from my reverie. "Anything concrete, or are we still chasing phantoms?" I looked up at him, my expression grim. "Concrete, yes, but I'm not going to like it." I stood, my gaze sweeping the tent one last time, searching for something, anything that would confirm my nascent theory. There had to be a trace, however minute. A subtle distortion in the air, perhaps, or a residue that wasn't immediately visible. My eyes snagged on a tiny, almost microscopic shimmer on a damp leaf near Finch's head. It wasn't water. It caught the light oddly, refracting it into a faint, almost prismatic spectrum. I leaned in closer, my gloved hand reaching for it. It was like a fine dust, metallic, but unlike any metal I knew. "What is it?" the detective asked, moving closer. "I don't know yet," I murmured, carefully collecting a sample onto a sterile slide. "But this isn't random. This wasn't a ghost, not in the way we understand it. This was engineered. This was a highly localized, directed energy transfer, a resonant electromagnetic field precisely tuned." I could see the skepticism in the detective's eyes even as he tried to hide it. He was a man of facts, of traditional forensics. This was stretching the boundaries of his comprehension, and honestly mine too. The data was screaming. The EM readings, the mark, the destroyed equipment, the subtle residue, they all pointed to an explanation far more terrifying than a mere ghost. Someone had developed a way to kill with an invisible hand, leaving behind only the echo of fear and the tantalizing, almost impossible scientific signature. My focus sharpened. If this was a weapon, it meant someone had built it, and if someone had built it, they had left a trail. I just had to find it. The rain hammered against the taut canvas of the crime scene tent, a relentless, drumming soundtrack to my thoughts. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang that always lingered after a life had been extinguished. The body, still there, covered now, lay like a silent accusation. I could see the skepticism in the detective's eyes even as he tried to hide it. This was stretching the boundaries of his comprehension, and honestly mine too until now. I still felt a tremor of disbelief, a whisper of doubt that this wasn't just my own mind playing tricks, but the data wouldn't lie. "User Ed," the detective began, his voice a low rumble against the rain. "Are you sure about this? We've got nothing tangible. No forced entry, no obvious weapon, no struggle. Just a lot of cold air and a victim who looks like he'd been scared to death by nothing." I turned from where I'd been examining a faint, almost imperceptible discoloration on the tent's inner wall, just above where the victim's head had rested. My determination felt like a tight knot in my gut, pulling me forward. "That's precisely it, detective. Nothing obvious, but science doesn't deal in nothing. It deals in what we haven't found yet." My gaze swept over the scene again, the yellow evidence markers stark against the dark ground. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, but the circumstances screamed foul play. Everything about it pointed to an unseen assailant, a phantom. But I knew better. I had to know better. "I've been reviewing the environmental readings," I continued, addressing the detective but also speaking to the lingering doubt in my own mind. "The temperature drop was significant, yes, but localized and transient. The victim's internal temperature readings showed a rapid core cooling, faster than ambient conditions alone would explain, but not as uniform as a true hypothermic event. And then there's this." I held it up. "On a microscopic level, there's a residue, barely visible, almost crystalline. It's a finely milled substance, an aerosolized particulate." "You're saying someone sprayed him with? What a fancy air freshener." I shook my head, coupled with a low-frequency infrasound generator. That got his attention. "Infrasound, you mean those things that make you feel uneasy?" "Precisely," I affirmed, my voice gaining momentum. "It bypasses the conscious ear, directly affecting the vestibular system and internal organs. Your heart would race, your blood pressure would spike, and if you have any pre-existing conditions or even just a strong enough shock, cardiac arrest is a very real outcome." I walked over to the edge of the tent, my eyes scanning the muddy ground outside the perimeter tape. The killer didn't need to touch him. They just needed to create the illusion of a ghostly presence, a manifestation of fear. It wasn't a ghost. Detective, it was a perfectly executed, horrifyingly precise psychological attack. "But how? How could someone manage that without leaving a trace?" he pressed, his skepticism warring with a growing curiosity. "They did leave a trace. I corrected, my gaze fixed on a particular spot in the mud, just outside the tent where the ground was slightly disturbed, almost too subtle to notice in the driving rain. The particulate, the infrasound device, they weren't just deployed and left. They were designed to be discreet, portable, and quickly removed. But there's a pattern, a signature. I pointed to the almost invisible disturbance. Look here, the mud just outside the tent. The rain is washing it away, but you can still see the impression. A unique tread, not a standard shoe, something wider with a specific, almost angular pattern. And these faint, almost translucent fibers caught on the thorny bush nearby. They match the residue I found on the victim, but they're also chemically similar to a fire-retardant material used in specialized protective gear. The detective bent down, his brow furrowed. Protective gear? For what? To handle the equipment, perhaps, I mused, my mind racing, putting the final pieces together. Or to protect themselves from the very elements they were deploying. And the unique tread. It's not a common boot. It's the kind of tread you'd find on, say, a specialized boot for industrial maintenance, or perhaps someone who works in environments requiring specific anti-slip or insulating properties. Then it hit me, a jolt of recognition. The peculiar angle of the impression, the slight scuff marks that suggested a precise, almost practiced movement. It wasn't just a boot, it was the boot. Wait a minute, I murmured, my eyes widening. That doesn't add up. I saw that tread before, not here but at the previous scene. The same unique pattern, almost identical, and the fibers. They match a sample I collected from a small tear in the clothing of the colleague who first discovered the victim. A sudden, chilling silence descended, broken only by the incessant drumming of the rain. The detective's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine, the skepticism finally replaced by a sudden horror. My mind replayed the scene, the colleague's overly dramatic reaction, the feigned shock, the subtle way they'd tried to guide our attention away from certain areas. It had seemed like genuine distress then. Now it reeked of calculated performance. Yes, I said, my voice firm, all doubt banished. The one who insisted on the ghostly explanation from the very beginning. The one who was so quick to dismiss any scientific possibility. The one who had the opportunity, the means, and now the signature. The tension in the air was palpable, thicker than the rain. I could practically see the gears turning in the detective's mind, connecting the dots I had just laid out. The human culprit wasn't some stranger. It was someone who had been right under our noses, exploiting the very human fear of the unknown, using science to mimic the supernatural. The ultimate betrayal. The storm outside seemed to mirror the one brewing within the tent. A tempest of revelation ready to break. The rain hammered against the taut canvas of the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered. A relentless drumbeat that somehow amplified the silence within. Water streamed down the plastic sheeting, distorting the world outside into a blurred, weeping watercolor. Inside, the air hung heavy and cold, thick with the metallic tang of blood, the damp earth, and the lingering, acrid scent of something I couldn't quite place initially. I watched the detective, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the victim. My words from moments ago still hung between us, a fragile bridge built over the chasm of the unexplained. A spontaneous event. The detective finally murmured, his voice a low rumble against the downpour. He didn't look at me, his focus still on the stillness on the ground. Nothing is spontaneous in the way we initially perceived it, I clarified, stepping closer to the body, my boots squelching slightly on the damp ground cover, and the subtle bruising around the wrist, almost like a brief, desperate struggle that was quickly subdued. Not enough to kill, but enough to incapacitate, to disorient. My mind raced, connecting the physical evidence to the psychological game. That was the initial report, but I'd seen it before or almost seen it. A flicker of a memory, a past failure, tightened my gut. A case where I'd missed the human element, dismissed it as panic, and a killer had walked away. Could I be doing it again? No, not this time. I pushed the memory back, focusing on the here and now. The details were different, not without a catalyst, not without a director. I stood, moving to the edge of the tent, scanning the ground, the very fabric of the temporary shelter. The victim had a profound fear of confined spaces, a history of panic attacks related to entrapment. We know this from their personal effects, their journal entries. And what do we find them in? A seemingly sealed room, no obvious entry, and a pervasive, low-frequency hum reported by the first responder, dismissed as the sound of the storm. The detective finally turned, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of comprehension beginning to dawn. The hum. I thought it was just the generator for the lights. Exactly. Easy to dismiss. But specific frequencies, inaudible to most, can induce extreme anxiety, disorientation, even a sense of impending doom. Combine that with a visual stimulus, tailored to a specific phobia. I trailed off, letting the implications sink in. I walked to the corner of the tent where the ground was slightly disturbed, away from the immediate vicinity of the body. And look here. A small, almost imperceptible scuff mark on the ground cover, leading to a tiny tear in the tent fabric, right at ground level. Not a tear from a struggle, but a deliberate cut, almost perfectly resealed with an adhesive that's only visible under specific UV light. We found traces of it earlier, but dismissed it as general debris. I crouched, pointing to the spot. This wasn't an entry point for a person. This was for a device. A small, portable projector, perhaps, coupled with a miniature speaker array, set to deploy and retract, leaving almost no trace. A projector. The detective sounded incredulous. To project what? A ghost. Precisely, I replied, a grim satisfaction settling over me. What better way to exploit a fear of the unknown than to create the unknown? Not random occurrences, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological torment, building to this final, fatal act. The detective rubbed his jaw, his eyes now darting around the tent, seeing it with new eyes. So, someone knew about the phobia, knew about the journal, knew about the escalating incidents. Someone with intimate knowledge, I confirmed, standing tall. Someone who had access, who could plant subtle cues, who could observe the victim's reactions, perfecting their psychological attack. The perpetrator wasn't a stranger. They were likely a trusted confidant, a family member, a close associate. Someone who could move freely, unsuspected within the victim's life. The pieces clicked into place, not just for the detective, but for me. The lingering acrid scent I couldn't place earlier, it wasn't blood or damp earth. It was a trace of ozone, a byproduct of the specific high-frequency sound emitter, now dissipating in the rain-swept air. The subtle bruising on the wrist, a brief, desperate attempt by the victim to cover their eyes, to shield themselves from the projected horror, a moment of physical struggle against an invisible tormentor. The motive, the detective pressed, his voice sharp now, the doubt replaced by a focused intensity. That's the final lock, I answered, my gaze returning to the stillness on the ground. But the key is access, opportunity, and the very specific, intimate knowledge of the victim's vulnerabilities. This wasn't a random act. I hadn't missed it this time. The rain continued its relentless beat, but the tension in the tent had shifted. The ghost had been unmasked, and in doing so, a small, fractured piece of my own past began to mend. The rhythmic drumming of rain on the taut canvas of the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, was the only sound for a long moment, a relentless percussion against the quiet hum of the portable generator. I stood over the gurney, the sheet-draped form beneath it now merely a testament to human cruelty, no longer a phantom puzzle. The lead detective, his face a roadmap of exhaustion and grudging respect, watched me waiting. "It wasn't a ghost," I responded, the words feeling solid, weighty, like the truth they were. My voice was low but carried, cutting through the downpour's insistence. It was an illusion, a theatrical performance designed to mask a very real, very human murder. I swept a hand towards the wall of the tent where, hours ago, the victim's final, terrified moments had played out. The initial impact, the one that broke the jaw and caused the internal bleeding, wasn't from a spectral force. It was a well-placed, blunt force trauma delivered by a spring-loaded mechanism hidden within the old grandfather clock. I gestured to the battered, ornate clock that still stood near the far wall, now tagged and bagged for transport. The clock wasn't just decorative, it was the weapon. The detective squinted, rubbing a hand over his chin. A spring-loaded mechanism in a clock. Exactly, I affirmed, stepping closer to the clock, though careful not to touch it. It was meticulously crafted. The pendulum, the face, even the chimes, all of it was modified. The ghostly apparition that our witnesses described, the one that seemed to shimmer and phase, was nothing more than a carefully timed projection. A small, high-lumen projector concealed behind the mantelpiece, aimed at a treated, almost invisible scrim dropped precisely when the victim entered the room. The scrim caught the light, creating the illusion of a translucent form. The cold that people felt, a simple blast of compressed air from a hidden canister, directed through a narrow vent, timed to coincide with the visual. I paused, letting the pieces fall into place for him. The victim, already prone to superstition, was terrified. Distracted by the visual and the sudden chill, they didn't notice the subtle shift in the clock's mechanism. The spring, triggered by a remote, fired a weighted, padded arm disguised as part of the clock's internal workings. The impact was swift, brutal, designed to look like a fall. Rather, their depravity shone through, I explained. They used the old house itself, pre-drilled holes in the floorboards almost imperceptible. Thin, taut wires strung through them connected to a small, hidden soundboard. When pulled or vibrated remotely, it mimicked the groans and creaks of an old house settling. A miniature speaker, disguised as a dust bunny, tucked under the baseboard, playing a pre-recorded, distorted loop, all designed to feed into the victim's specific fears, their belief in the supernatural. They knew what would break the victim's resolve, what would make them vulnerable. The detective walked over to the clock, examining it with new eyes. So the actual killer, they weren't even in the room when it happened. Precisely, they were observing, waiting for the perfect moment. The entire setup was a stage. They counted on us, the investigators, to be so caught up in the ghost narrative that we'd miss the mechanics, the physical evidence. And who, the detective asked, his voice now edged with a different kind of tension, would go to such elaborate lengths? Someone with a very specific motive, a very intimate knowledge of both the victim and the house. I stated, the answer feeling like a weight settling. Someone who stood to gain significantly from the victim's death. Also someone who knew the victim's deepest fears, their vulnerabilities. The perpetrator orchestrated this entire macabre play to make the death appear accidental or supernatural, to avoid suspicion, to make it look like fate, not murder. My gaze drifted to the tent flap where the rain was a shimmering curtain. The groundskeeper, I finally said, the name feeling less like a reveal and more like a final confirmation of what I'd already known. He had access, the technical skills, a simmering resentment that boiled over into greed. We found the remote in his workshop, disguised as a garage door opener. The projector, the air canister, all of it stashed poorly in a hidden compartment beneath a workbench. He thought he was clever, thought he could hide behind a veil of superstition. A sense of profound weariness settled over me, mingling with the quiet triumph. It was done. The impossible had been explained. The ghost had been unmasked, not as a spirit, but as a shadow cast by human malice. The rain continued, a cleansing deluge. The scar of that old, forgotten case would always be there, a faint throb beneath the surface, a reminder of the cost of missing the details. But it no longer defined me. It no longer paralyzed me. I looked at the detective, a small, almost imperceptible nod passing between us. The tension in the tent shifted, from the suspense of the unknown to the grim reality of processing the known. My work here was done. I had confronted the limits of scientific explanation, only to prove that science, logic, and meticulous observation could always, eventually, prevail against even the most elaborate deceptions. The world wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by the choices of its inhabitants. And sometimes the most terrifying monsters were the ones that hid in plain sight, cloaked in cleverness and fear. But I was ready for them. I had seen the ghost, and I had found the human hand that pulled its strings, and I was moving forward.